When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be talking about Elia Martell, number 94 in our Best Song of Ice and Fire Best Characters. And you might be wondering, why is Elia maybe even on this list? Why is she higher than some other characters? For me personally, I just think Elia is a very important character to the story in terms of her relationship with Rhaegar, her as a figure in terms of how she impacts the story, even in the main story. She is one of the first, Dornish characters we're really introduced to in the main story, or at least, is known of, not really introduced because she's dead, of course, by the main story. And she's a very interesting character in terms of her dynamic, how her life ends up going. So we're going to talk about all of that in today's video. Also, before you guys start typing in the comments, this is my memory foam little, bed topper. I'm washing my sheets, so don't get your panties in a twist and all that, okay? Just wanted to, put that out there. But thank you to my members and my Patreons for supporting me on this channel. If you did want to become one, I will have another House of the Dragon preview video up this week, and also for House of the Dragon going forward, all of my little condensed summaries, or what are my overall thoughts of the episode, will be for my members and Patreon, so I hope you guys all enjoy those. And let's get into the video. So Elia Martell, she is most notably known as the sister of Oberyn Martell, and also the wife of Rhaegar. She is born somewhere in between 256 and 257 AC. We don't know exactly what year, but it's just in that time frame. She is less than 30 years old when she dies. She was still very young. But let's get a brief description on Elia Martell before we get into the story. Elia Martell was said to be beautiful, slender, with black eyes and a flat chest. She always had a delicate health, having been born a month premature, which did not permit her much travel in her youth. According to Barristan Selmy, Elia was a gentle, good, and gracious lady, but he also describes her as frail due to her delicate health. He also says she was kind and clever, with a sweet wit. Elia is kind of given this description that's quite interesting, right? Yes, it is said she's pretty and, all that stuff, but more importantly, she's kind, she's clever, she seems to be, a good type of person in this world that you might want to marry. And so when you look at her early years, Elia Martell really grows close to her brother Oberyn, who is only a year below her. Elia Martell, it's kind of interesting because we don't know who her mother or her father was, but we know she grew up, being the first daughter of that. And she had brothers in Duran and Oberyn. She had a family member, Lewin Martell, in the Kingsguard. Elia had quite a lot of people that were important close to her. But from an early age, it seemed like she was going to die. She was born premature. Again, birthing is also very difficult to do in this world. Duran himself did not expect her to live when he learned about her birth, but she did survive. However, this would have a huge problem for her going forward. Her health was always fragile, something that's very similar between her and Duran. Duran is also someone that's not that old, but he has a lot of issues in terms of his health condition. We really see that in A Feast for Crows right off the bat. But similar to last video when we talked about Rhaegar Targaryen and his sister, Elia kind of grew more closer to Oberyn than she did Duran, as Oberyn was born about a year after her. But from an early age, we don't know too much about Elia. We don't know what she was learning and kind of what was going on with the character, but we can kind of assume that she was just growing close to Oberyn, learning how to, be a lady or to rule, because it's very different in Dorne in terms of how women are treated. And so Elia is quite an interesting figure in terms of that, because when we get to the Dornish, her mother actually tries to make a lot of different marriage alliances, and she doesn't look within Dorne, she looks to other places. They go to Starfall, to the Arbor, Old Town, the Shield Islands, Crakehall, and then finally Casterly Rock, trying to find a marriage for both Elia and Oberyn. Very interesting, because I think the Dornish were definitely in this time period where they were really trying to connect themselves into Westeros, which wasn't something unheard of, right? That was something they were really trying to do when they kind of came into the realm under Daeron's reign. So they were really in a position where there was a lot of, at this time, marriage alliances that were really trying to gain power and support. And that's made even more clear here. I talked about briefly about Elia and Oberyn's marriages or lack of marriages in my Robert's Rebellion video at the very beginning, but it's made very clear here that Elia was trying to be married off to a very high lord, which makes sense, right? She is born of the most powerful house in Dorne. But in terms of all these places that they went, it doesn't seem like any of them were really fit for Elia. Oberyn even mocked most of them, but even when Elia seemed to find someone she really liked, and this could have been a very big marriage, if Elia had actually married Baelor Hightower, what could have changed? The world would have been completely different. But even think about that alliance. The Hightowers are probably the most powerful house in the Reach outside of the Tyrells, but, the Hightowers are married into the Tyrells, so you could make an argument there that the Hightowers are really powerful in the Reach. Maybe not as powerful as like during House of the Dragon times, but still very powerful. And that would have been a huge marriage, and also would have prevented Elia and Rhaegar eventually marrying, which becomes a huge problem because Elia's health condition is a huge worry in terms of how many children can she actually have because of her condition. Will she die early from a sickness? There's a lot to think about in terms of Elia if you're someone trying to marry to the Martells. And luckily, Elia is in a really great house in terms of power and wanting their support that, you can kind of look past those things, but it's something that's going to creep up a lot once we get into the, main Rhaegar and Robert's Rebellion plotline. But Elia had been half in love with Baelor Hightower until he had farted in her presence. Unfortunate. Probably shouldn't fart in front of the girl you're trying to court. Baelor, you didn't live up to Baelor Breakspear. That's all I'll say. Maybe Baelor the Blessed. But yeah. But this led Oberyn to naming him Baelor Breakwin. And it kind of gives me this weird thing is because Oberyn, I think, really comes off as Elia's older brother. But he's not. He is younger than her by a year. Oberyn is very protective of Elia. He wants Elia to have a really good man to protect her and things like that. And, actually be her husband, be a strong man. And you can really see that here. It seems like kind of the opposite roles are here, where it's like Oberyn kind of feels like the older brother. Doran kind of feels like maybe the younger brother in terms of the way he acts towards like Elia and stuff like that. It is an interesting dynamic. And we're also not ever seeing that Doran and Elia had this really impactful relationship. Like Doran is obviously very, angry of her death and things like that, but it seems like they did not have nearly as close of a relationship as someone like Oberyn and Elia did have. But given that, he gets this nickname that's really bad, Elia just can't look at him the same, and that kind of ends that courtship. But Elia's mother had known Lady Joanna Lannister from the time they had both served as ladies in waiting. Again, there's just a lot of connection in terms of all the different houses kind of mingling together because of the War of the Stepstones, because of Tywin being made Hand of the King, all this type of stuff, to connecting a lot of these different houses during this time. I talk about that a lot with Robert's side of the war going on during this, that's building up to this, right? A lot of the different connections that are made during the War of the Stepstones, a little bit of that is here as well. And despite having learned of Joanna's death and childbirth in 273 AC, during their stay at Old Town, the Martells traveled to Casterly Rock regardless. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. Well, one is maybe Elia's mother wanted to pay homage to Joanna because a lot of people seemed to like her. She was a very well-loved woman. And another part of it is, you're not going to just stop this travel to Casterly Rock because she died. You're still going to at least broach the subject to Tywin. And also, it seems on the outset a very good match, right? Either marrying Jaime to Elia or marrying Oberyn to Cersei. And it's quite interesting because that seemed like it was the plan the whole time, right? Based upon their ship, it had an extra cabin for, seems like a higher person, and that seemed to be one of the two. And this would have been huge, right? If the Dornish had actually aligned with the Lannisters, it would have made a huge match. Now, the reason I don't think it was done, I think there is a specific reason. So one is Tywin was wanting Cersei to be married to Rhaegar because he wanted to get his family on the throne, or at least connected to the throne. Very similar to Otto Hightower during the House of the Dragon time period. That's why the characters are so similar. So that part of it makes sense. But Jaime as well. He was not also in the Kingsguard yet, and he was a candidate, could be betrothed to someone. And we know that there was a chance that maybe, Jaime would have been courted with, Lysa or Catelyn or whoever. But I think there's a lot of reasoning as to why Tywin maybe thought, let's not do that. Because in a lot of ways, geographically, it makes a lot of sense to actually have Jaime marry Lysa if he got the opportunity. Because in a lot of ways, it makes sense. The River Lords are your closest, maybe ally or enemy. So having them as a buffer zone for you is really important, especially if like the Greyjoys attack, the Sea Guard and the Malisters are very important to that. Having the Tullys be tied into your family would be really impactful. Plus, you look at kind of what else was going on, betrothals between, Lyanna and Robert starting to murmur, and, at this time, Brandon to Catelyn. There was a lot of that stuff starting to murmur in terms of, okay, this alliance isn't building, right? And so, in terms of Tywin's thought process, I understand why he doesn't marry Elia, or doesn't have Jaime betrothed to Elia. But I do think it's a big misstep, because I think tying Elia to the Lannisters would have been a fantastic marriage for them, but unfortunately it doesn't go that way, and neither one end up actually marrying. But instead, Tywin does something different. Tywin decides to try and give Tyrion, who's a fresh baby, to be the betrothed to Elia instead, which was taken as an insult. And it probably should be, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense for them to accept Tyrion. What was Tywin's big plan for Jaime outside of what I talked about, right? It had to have been something along the lines of he was waiting for Lysa or some other better marriage for Jaime, because the Targaryens had no women at this time for Jaime to be betrothed to. So he wasn't looking there. So where was he looking to make this alliance for Jaime and somebody else? It's interesting to think about, and it changes everything, right? We've now had two different occurrences that would have been perfect situations for the Martells to not end up going down the route they end up going, and it could have completely changed the way Westeros went at this time. But it also shows you something else. The Martells were not aiming for, the kingdoms, right, at this time. The Martells were aiming to make alliances with other great houses. Rhaegar, yeah, he didn't have anyone he was betrothed to. And I think if you're the Martells, you got to be thinking, okay, well, there's no chance we're ever going to get, on the throne with Rhaegar. Aerys just does not seem like the guy that likes the Dornish, which is proven later on. So they were kind of thinking, okay, let's just make a very strong alliance with other houses, is probably what I think Elia's mother was probably thinking. Elia herself, how would she have been thinking about all of this? Being kind of shown around to all these different, lords, or I guess heirs to be lords and things like that. It's a weird feeling. I feel like, and especially because this is kind of the first woman character we're doing that's in Westeros, that's a Westerosi lady. This isn't Ygritte. Ygritte's culture is way different. Elia would be kind of going around, paraded around, looking to see if all these people want her. It's got to be a really bad feeling, I feel like. I guess there's two different ways you can take it. You're getting all this attention from all these men and things like that. But you can also take it the Rhaenyra way, where it's like she's kind of just being tried to sold off, and she also doesn't have great health. It's got to be interesting to think about what Elia was thinking about all those things and the fear that she could have had, even though she does seem to be a very happy, person. We don't really get the indication that she seemed like a more depressed, sad version, like a Shara Dane maybe towards the end. But that is what we know of at this time. But by 279 AC, Rhaegar and Elia were betrothed. So she was only at this time, she was around the age of 22 to 23, which is interesting, right? It took that long for her to be betrothed. And the question is why, right? Like, young ladies seem to get betrothed much earlier than this, right? Like, this is actually quite an old age in terms of being betrothed or married in this world. That's interesting, right? Like, maybe it's one of those things where, they did this whole thing, we're trying to get Elia married and all this, and it just doesn't work. And then out of nowhere, they just get this betrothal offer for Elia. And even that itself seems quite weird. Why would Aerys allow Rhaegar to take Elia if he doesn't like the Dornish? And the simple answer could be there wasn't really a lot of other available candidates if you didn't want Cersei as well, because Aerys flat out refused Cersei, which was kind of smart, kind of not smart, because you already kind of had Tywin in your back pocket for the most part. Getting Elia made sense. You tie a kingdom to yourself. It's just the way he treats them wasn't the best. But if you're Elia, you've now gone for this thing where you've gone for, not minor houses, but they're not like the top house and then the Lannisters, of course. But, going through the High Towers, going through Craig Hall, going to all these. And now you're going to become the queen. Rhaegar is the heir to the throne. It's got to be such an interesting moment for Elia, like realizing, oh, you're going with this great, handsome, young prince, and you're going to end up being the queen one day. Elia must have felt a lot like Sansa did in a Game of Thrones, where you're married to you're going to be betrothed to this great, prince. And for Elia, it's quite different because she's older, right? So she's going to, marry him right very soon after this in 280 AC, in a great ceremony at the Great Sept of Baelor and King's Landing. And soon after this, they would move to Dragonstone shortly after the wedding, which makes sense. The tensions were growing between Rhaegar and Aerys. And Elia is put in a very dangerous position because we kind of have a repeat of history in terms of you have the Aegon IV camp and you have the Daeron camp, right? In terms of the first Blackfire Rebellion, a lot of that happening before. And so that kind of is where Elia's position is, right? The Martells have now tied themselves to the crown. It's a very difficult position that she's now in. And about this wedding, and it's something I put in the title to kind of, because I think it's one of the biggest talking points of Elia's life, is her marriage to Rhaegar. And I have a quote that I want to talk about from Barristan when he's talking to Daenerys about Elia. But this kind of describes where I think Elia and Rhaegar went wrong. Princess Elia was a good woman, Your Grace. She was kind and clever, with a gentle heart and a sweet wit. I know the prince was very fond of her. So, from that quote alone, and Barristan would be somebody that would be able to tell this, being around Rhaegar a lot, and Elia, and probably being at their, wedding and all this stuff. It seems like the two got along together, and I think they were good together, but I don't think Rhaegar ever loved Elia. I do think this was more one of those situations where Elia, just for Rhaegar, was not someone he was in love with, but someone that he got along with really well, and so their marriage kind of worked. But there's a but there. Because of Elia's health, that's not going to allow Rhaegar to fulfill this prophecy that he seems to have, that he's chasing so badly that he does some pretty awful things to Elia. But later in that same year, Rhaegar and Elia's first child was born, Princess Rhaenys, being named after the namesake Rhaenys from Aegon's conquest, his sister wife. A really big and interesting move. And it tells you right away what Rhaegar was thinking. He was trying to recreate the three heads of the dragon, and this is even more so when you see his second child. But before we get to that, the baby was presented to Rhaegar's parents at court. And Queen Rhaella, because she's obviously a very likable character, she went through a lot of bad in her life, she seemed very happy to have a grandchild. And that's not so with Aerys. Aerys said she smelled of Dornish, and he's just a racist bastard, and he's the one that basically allowed this marriage to happen. Kind of hypocritical. And also it just comes to this point, this Rhaegar and Aerys just had this massive split at this time. But only 2 years later, Rhaegar and Elia's second child, Prince Aegon, was born near the new year of 282 AC. And again, we're kind of told here that the relationship seemed to be happy but not romantic. And again, they did their duty because they had 2 kids fairly quickly into their marriage. But this is where things start to go wrong. Elia, during this time, her health became more problematic. She remained fairly frail. Elia was bedridden for half a year after giving birth to Rhaenys, and giving birth to Aegon had nearly killed her. Really paints the picture going on here that this is taking a huge toll on her. She can't do this anymore. And even Rhaegar had to have realized that. And Rhaegar, maybe he didn't love her, but was still very fond of her, like Barristan talks about, wouldn't have wanted to exert her again. He was very close to death, and we know what happens. We've seen this throughout history of the Targaryens over and over again. If you want to look at Aemma Arryn's death, if you want to look at Laena's death, Rhaegar actually seems to be a bit cautious here, as the Maesters even told Rhaegar that Elia could not bear any more children. And you would think this should be enough. Elia had given Rhaegar 2 children. That wasn't enough for Rhaegar. He was trying to recreate the prophecy of having the 3 heads of the dragon, and maybe he even knew about Aegon's dream, but we just don't really know. But this is where the story takes a very dark turn for Elia. Because Rhaegar, in a lot of ways, I think he was already trying to find his next missus. He needed somebody else to give him a child, and Elia just couldn't. And so Elia, for maybe the greater good in Rhaegar's mind, and everybody's rational minds, Rhaegar's just a dick, decides to more or less publicly shame Elia and run away with another woman. Because Elia attends the tourney of Harrenhal in 281 AC. And this happens before Aegon's birth, but already we were on that path. Elia was pregnant probably by this time. But during this time, Elia attends the tourney in Harrenhal. And of course, we know the story. Rhaegar wins the tournament and was to crown the Queen of Love and Beauty. But he didn't give it to Elia. He gives it to Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, which tells you a lot. He was already looking for another mistress or woman to have his third child even before Elia had Aegon. It tells you where Rhaegar was at. Was this a story of him falling for some other woman, like maybe Robb in the show? Was it a story of, Rhaegar just blatantly needed another child, Lyanna caught his eye? It's to be determined. We just don't know yet about the relationship. But either way, this would have been devastating for Elia. And I think she would have felt a lot of shame and felt a lot of, self-confidence issues in terms of your husband's giving the crown of love and beauty to another woman. That's like, by today's standards, like watching your husband in front of an entire group of people, like all of your families, like trying to flirt with another woman. Like, it is a massive affront to Elia, and it only gets worse. At the start of the next year, Rhaegar left Elia and their newborn son, Aegon, on Dragonstone, and took to the road with several companions. And think about this. Directly after Rhaegar seems to get the news that his wife cannot have any more children, he goes out looking for Lyanna. He's already seemed to planted the seed of this romance between himself and Lyanna. Some would say he was grooming her, which I wouldn't disagree with. And so this is where Robert's Rebellion starts. Elia's husband goes off with another woman, and she is left to raise their two children. One of them has just been born. Aegon is not even there with his father. His father all but abandons him. And that's all we know of Elia in terms of the big picture story. But we all know what happens in Robert's Rebellion. I'm not going to break it down for you. I'll kind of break down some of the Dornish plotline. But of course, Rhaegar Martell, of course, the Dornish would have been furious over Elia's Martell being publicly shamed, her husband's running off with another woman. He would have been quite pissed. And Aerys uses this against the Dornish. He has Elia as more or less a prisoner, right? He threatens Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard and gracefully reminds him that he has them more or less as prisoners. Aerys would keep Elia and both of their children in King's Landing. And if you're Elia, you have to feel helpless. You've done nothing wrong, but here you are being used so that your family will participate in this war. You've done nothing. You've been just trying to raise your children, do the best you can, and, things that you are out of your control. Her health, she can't control that. Her husband runs off with another woman when she needed him most. It's a very tragic story. I think Elia is one of the most tragic characters within A Song of Ice and Fire. I really enjoy the character, but that's not where Elia's character ends, unfortunately. After the Battle of the Trident, Elia's husband is killed. But there is a time period which would have been interesting. When Elia's at King's Landing, Rhaegar also is there very briefly. Would Rhaegar and Elia have even spoken? Was there anything that was said between the two, or even, Rhaegar coming to see his children? We don't know. And that's one of the reasons I would love to see more of Jaime or Barristan thinking about Rhaegar, because we don't know really what happens when he comes back to the capital to gain the forces for the loyalists and all that. But you'd have to think there was some conversation there. And Elia would have been very pissed off, probably. And I think Elia, by the time she dies, was already quite broken as a character, as she feels abandoned. But as she hears Rhaegar dies, Elia now has two children without a father. The Lannisters come to the gates, sacking the city of King's Landing. And unfortunately for Elia, Her daughter, Princess Rhaenys, was killed by Amory after breaking the door down. He dragged the screaming toddler from under her father's bed and stabbed her over 50 times. Gregor then murdered Elia's son, Prince Aegon, in front of her by smashing his head against a wall. And if this wasn't enough, watching her children killed in the most brutal fashion ever, something no mother should ever have to see. We think about some things that are going to happen in House of the Dragon, and you look at Elia, she sees the worst things possible right before her death. And even in her awful health state, she's then raped by the Mountain and killed by crushing her head. Elia ends the story in one of the most horrifying fashions you could ever imagine, watching her loved ones all die around her, being held a prisoner for the entirety of the war as a hostage for doing nothing wrong, and being killed in the brutal fashion that she was. But this had rippling consequences. Ned and Robert, their relationship would never really be truly the same after this moment, as it was seen as this moment that was needed to happen because the Targaryens needed to be out of the way. But why did Elia need to die? And that's something we still don't have clarified in the book. We don't know why Elia was killed. Was it because Tywin forgot to mention it to Gregor or Amory? Or was it because, he wanted Elia to die as well, as some sort of slight in terms of because of the Elia got on the throne while Cersei could not? We don't know. It's made very unclear. I find that it's probably just Gregor, being this awful human being that he is, probably just did it himself. But Elia's effects would linger on. Oberyn, upon hearing this, would try to rally the Dornish to avenge his sister. But he was talked down by Doran as they planned to get the Targaryens back on the throne. And that's not all. We don't know in the story now, but the tensions between the Dornish and the Lannisters are still there. Oberyn makes that quite clear in A Storm of Swords. But with this character of Aegon, young Griff, is Elia's legacy still alive, or is it a lie? Is it someone else using her children, her, line to gain things? It's another slight that you could almost see to Elia, is that someone is using her child's name, and it could be the downfall of the rest of her family. Elia has died, and her brother has now died in the normal story, but will Doran also die by the end of the story? It's all interesting, and I find, Elia, there's not a ton in terms of, actual lore, compared to, others, for instance, in this series. There's so much you can look at and think about what Elia was thinking in these moments, how Elia, went down, how she had to do all these things, and what she was feeling. But let me know what you guys think about Elia Martell. I don't know if you guys think this was too low. Maybe she shouldn't have been on the list. I had a very hard time placing Elia because she's very significant to the story. She's a very interesting character, but we just don't see a lot of her. And so that's kind of where I was like, I don't know. I feel like she can't be above a lot of the other characters that have more drawn out backstories and stuff like that. But she also can't be off the list either, because I think she's very significant to the story. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.